And so I said, let's do Riel and Dumont. No one that I know of that I've seen has written a book where equal weight is given to both men, and I think it's really important to give equal weight to these two men. Both Métis in such different ways, and yet came together for a year and a half. They only knew each other a year and a half, and it kind of changed Canada's course in those short months. And so I began the story, the research, years of research on the two. There's not so much on Dumont, but there's a lot more on Riel, as you all, I'm sure, know. And so I began digging in. I'd read plenty. I thought I knew a lot. I thought I knew it all. Like I said, I was young. I quickly learned, oh my, what have I gotten myself into? It really was the toughest book in many ways that I've ever written. So.
But it's interesting because because there's been so much more written about Riel. There's so much. He was a writer,
yeah,
you know, and he was an intellectual, a European intellectual in many ways. But of course, that means that the Métis story always ends up being a story of defeat and martyrdom, in a way. Yeah. Whereas Dumont is somebody who never considered himself to be defeated, I guess you could say.
No, he didn't. He, I think something broke in him the day he had to leave Batoche when everything was over. The last shots had been fired. His people had been crushed. The women were starving. The children were starving. I think something in him did break, though, when he had to ride to Montana. He ended up joining the Wild West show a year later, and that to me was a sign, yeah, and everything wasn't well in his world. But I think he didn't want to admit defeat, but I think he felt crushed. Everyone wanted him. I think Canadians at the time wanted him. The whole talk was he's going to come back and try to rescue Riel, and we're going to have this soap opera unfold in front of us, and that was the plan, and he was never able to put it together, knew it was a suicide mission, and knew better of it.
But he still had all those guts because I mean, Riel was made into a political tool in Quebec, partly for the right reasons and partly for the wrong reasons. And he was brought back for Mercier's election campaign.
Dumont was, yeah. He certainly was. He was brought back up into Quebec. He joined Buffalo Bill's show. His wife died, and that was the love of his life shortly after he ended up in Montana in exile. And that's, I think, what made him say, okay, I need to find something. Buffalo Bill came to him and said, I want you to join this show. And he wasn't allowed to be in Canada, so he was this rebel that was living in the States at large, and at large criminal, basically. And so he drew large crowds, and then about 6 months later, Canada said, we pardon you. Shortly after they hanged Riel, they said, we pardon you now. And so his kind of draw as this kind of criminal figure living in America in exile diminished quickly, and he left, and right away a number of Quebec politicians came to him and said, come and represent for us, and he tried. He was a man of the land. He wasn't an orator like Riel was, and he had very mixed reviews and mixed responses to his speeches that he
came out against the priest.
He came out, which was in Quebec, you can't do that. He came out
in a pro-priest campaign.
Yeah, and in the late 1880s, you can't, even now, you can't really come out against the priest without suffering something. But he did, and that was a no-no, and so he was quickly. He didn't end up getting home to Batoche again until early 1900s, late 1899 or so, and wasn't given title to his land until a few years before he died, which is really what the whole Métis uprisings in the West were all about, is title to land and to way of life and to culture.
But isn't it amazing that elections were fought around this disaster of the Métis and how horrible the Métis were, and all the racism and everything, and hanging them, and the loss of the land. And then today, you do the most important series ever done in Canadian biography, and there's Riel and Dumont, whereas the people who hung him aren't in the series, right? And in fact, the general who won the battle, nobody even remembers his name.
Yeah, Middleton. I do, because I had.
You do. You had to remember it.
It's very true. It's and what I really appreciate is the number of people who proudly identify as Métis. I think the hope with the Canadian government way back when was to say, these people will die out. They will, bleach into the mainstay of Canada. But the Métis traditions are alive and well right across Canada. Alberta.
Actually, more and more people are actually just self-declaring, which is really interesting.
which is great. Yeah, people wanting to touch base with that part of their roots. And in Canada, I think if your family goes back long enough, you're going to find probably some native blood is often the way it works in this country.
Well, if you were doing well, there would be native blood.
Yeah.
Because that would be one of the signs of prosperity, that you were married into native families. And things. Yeah.
Marrying into the ones who knew the land and how to survive.
Yeah. Well, I had to talk myself into doing this book. And
I was going to ask you, the same question. Why did you choose these? It kind of surprised me in a way, but it didn't in the same way.
Well, I've been thinking about them and talking about them tangentially for years and mentioning them in books and so on. And the interesting thing is you can there's two parallel histories of Canada. One of them is the one that I wrote about in A Fair Country, which is this idea of the centrality of the Aboriginal role and its influence in Canada. And then there's this other thing, which is related, but it's parallel, which is the rise of the idea of the non-monolithic, attempts at non-violence, living with complexity country, and sort of say, well, it was always there. It was there with the Aboriginals, it was there with the Métis and so on. But how did it get into mainstream politics and democracy? And of course, no matter how often you're told that Canada popped out of a tin with Johnny MacDonald in 1867, which is just completely invented by Donald Creighton and people like that who hated French Canadians and Catholics and were anti-Semitic. But apart from that, we're just great. And rewrote Canadian history so that it was all about Scots and Anglophones and no natives, no French Canadians, no immigrants, sort of thing. Let's put it this way: if you could get MacDonald and Cartier in the room, and you said, "Okay, George, John, why did you do it when you got it right? Why did you do it the way you did?" And they say, "Oh, it was all about LaFontaine and Baldwin. We were just doing what they did. It was all based on their model." And then you say, "Well, how come no Canadians know about them? They don't know what this model is. They don't know how it happened." And at school, at most, you were taught, responsible government. And it's taught in such a boring way. Just appallingly boring, so that before they finish the paragraph, you've fallen asleep and think, "Oh, well, Canadian politics, constitutions, responsible government." And of course, if it was so boring, why has it worked for 160 years or whatever? And what is this model? Where does it come from? And so you go back and you look at these two guys and you find something really astonishing. I mean, that's what's interesting is these two pairings, is they're really astonishing people. I mean, one's, Catholic Montrealer, basically from a poor family, LaFontaine, who makes his way as a sportsman and a thug, in the sense that he was the bodyguard to Papineau in the riots, and he was a really good boxer. And in fact, at one point,
he's the one I like a lot.
Somebody criticized his wife once during a nationalist movement, and a journalist, and he went out and found them in the street and pounded them out. It's really an interesting intellectual. Right? Who started out as this muscular guy and became this astonishing inventor of a whole new way to think about society in Canada. And on the other hand, in Toronto, you have this Anglican aristocrat, son of probably the richest family in Toronto, or one of the two richest families in Toronto. Every reason to belong to the family compact, every reason. And his father, for something, gets his goat, and he starts going more and more against the family compact, and his son, Robert Baldwin, and they become the enemies of the family compact. You go down to the Anglican Cathedral, St. James, and if you walk in on the side, left-hand side, the pews aren't there anymore. Up against the wall at the front, those are all the Baldwin pews. And in order to look at their arch enemy, Bishop Strachan, they had to look across the people sitting in the front three pews, which belonged to the Jarvises, their other arch enemies. So it tells you how tight and, how much enmity there was in the elite.